It really only takes about 5.5 seconds into our sewing journeys to realize that not all fabrics are the same. Some are a dream to work with and others are an absolute nightmare, as you know. So in this video, I am breaking it down so you can learn to understand how to tell if a fabric is going to be easy or difficult to work with, just so you can be prepared for any challenges that gorgeous fabric that you found might throw at you while sewing it up. Welcome back, my sewing friends. It is delightful to see you again. If you are actually new here, welcome. We do everything vintage sewing skills to help your modern day sewing so you can really get better at garment sewing. That's what we specialize here. So if it sounds like something that you're interested in, do hit the subscribe button down below so you can be notified of all of my future videos. And now today we are continuing actually our topic of fabric. So I have made some videos of late about this, and it's something that I've been talking about a lot at Vintage Sewing School. That's my online school. So I have just created a whole course there about it. And so we're bringing this topic here because, as you know, no fabrics are created the same, and some are, they throw you a curveball, right? So difficult to work with, those nightmare fabrics that you just think, what happened? Let's talk through how to actually look and assess different fabrics to know whether it's going to be easy or hard to sew with, just so you can understand what you're looking for and know those choices. Now, I will say that just because some are hard to work with and some are easier to work with, it doesn't mean that as a beginner sewer you shouldn't work with those hard to sew fabrics. It's about knowing it and being prepared for it that we need to know. I think it's when we go in and where we don't realize that knits need different needles or different stitches, for example, that we go in, and if you don't know this, it turns into a total disaster. So it's not about avoiding anything, it's about being prepared for the fabric that you have on hand. Okay, let's actually divide this into two categories. One is actually if it's going to be difficult to cut and mark, because that is something completely different. And then if it's going to be difficult to actually sew with, and we'll divide it into knits and wovens for each, because as you know, they are different. So let's start. How do you know if a fabric is going to be difficult to cut out and you're marking? For wovens, so basically here, drape and softness are your enemies. The drapier it is, the more the fabric moves around, the harder it will be to cut. So, for example, things like rayon, viscose, bamboo, all these types of fibers are very drapey, very soft. Crepes, chiffons, the fabric, the way the fabric is made is really soft. It wants to fall into a little ball, and basically that's what it does on the table, as opposed to something like this that is structured, that holds its shape. So if you lay fabric out on the table, for example, and if you can do this, and it is like the fabric moves and it balls up and it just slides around, even if it's not sliding on the table, but it will stay there and it will move, as opposed to, say, this linen here, you can see it's structured, right? It wants to keep its shape, whereas this rayon does not. And so this is difficult to work with because as you move your pattern, any movement that in there at all affects and it warps the fabric, and when you're cutting, it will warp the shape, and it's really quite tricky to sometimes to work with and navigate. It takes a bit of a greater skill, whereas this linen and plain cottons, for example, they just stay there. They don't move. They are wonderful because it's really hard to make mistakes because they don't move on the table for you. So that's what makes those easy. So the easy choices are structured fabrics that hold their shape on the table. If you put it on the table and it just wants to bunch up in a little ball, that means it's going to be more difficult to work with. And so what about knits? When we look at knits, pretty much, again, drape is the main factor in whether it's going to be difficult to cut out and work with. And the curl factor of jersey can affect the cutting as well. So the same thing applies. It's generally with knits especially, it's generally the fibers that are going to affect it. So the viscose, the rayons, the bamboo, modal, these types of fibers will give it really like a drapiness, and it will give it that It's very, very lovely to wear and makes a fabulous garment, but cutting it out does put it in the harder to manage category because it just wants to move. So the same thing, if you lay it on the table and you kind of just push it around a little bit, if it wants to just curl up into a ball and move around a lot, that means when you put your pattern on and you're trying to cut it, it will want to move on you as well. If it just tends to hold its shape and stay flat in a rigid piece of fabric, it's going to be easier to work with because that is how it's going to stay as you're trying to cut it all out. And now with knits, when we cut, we're marking our fabric as well. And so the curling over of the cut edges on jersey, for example, can make it quite difficult to mark because there's no edge left to mark. After that, you have to try and curl it out and then mark it. So that can be a little bit tricky to navigate when you're cutting and marking out your fabric too. So something to look at and consider. It's only on some knits, so all you have to do is stretch it and see if it curls or not on a cut edge. So one of those cut edges, not the selvages. So let's move on and look at how to know if it's going to be difficult to actually sew with. So we have it all cut out and marked, but sewing is different because you have the foot and your pins and you have to sort of put it through the machine and it not warp, stretch, fray out, all sorts of random horrible things that happen. So let's have a look at wovens. Again, drape is one of the things that do make it more difficult because it means that the fabric will want to move a lot. More so, it does affect it, but also the slipperiness is what is really important when we're looking at easy or difficult to sew with when it comes to woven fabrics. By slipperiness, I mean basically put your 2 layers together and rub them between your fingers. I think it's best demonstrated like this on camera, and move it around. If it just slips between those 2 layers really easily and it just does like this, you guessed it, that's what it's going to do when you're sewing it, and it will be a nightmare. Whereas, say, this plain quilting cotton, for example, is kind of like, I call quilting cotton 0.00 level to start with. It's like the even playing field. This doesn't want to move at all. So this is going to be nice and easy to work with because both as I'm pinning this, it will stay its shape, it won't move around, it'll stay where it's pinned. As I'm sewing this through the machine, it won't want to warp and twist and move. It'll stay exactly where it's pinned and I can sew it really well under the machine. As opposed to this slippery one, under the machine, it is going to go everywhere. I have to constantly adjust. It's just slipping and sliding and it does make it difficult to work with. So the simple test of the slipperiness is a real easy one to know how hard it will be to work with. And then there is the fabric thickness. So generally, like I said, quilting cotton is kind of that medium weight in the middle fabric like this. And then with woven fabrics, when you go to either end of the spectrum of weight, so super lightweight and then super heavyweight, they become harder to work with because often we're layering up. So we're very often in garment sewing, we'll have 4 layers of fabric together when we're sewing over seams that join. There's many, many layers together. And as soon as you start to get to thicker fabrics, if you fold your fabric into 2 layers and you think, oh, that's pretty thick, do that again and see how thick 4 layers is, and you are going to have to sew over that, guaranteed, in garment sewing. So the thicker, like when you get to those super thick ones, it will be harder. You'll need a thicker, heavier duty needle to deal with it, and it just becomes harder to put through the machine. So something to think about is the weight. And on the other spectrum, of course, is those super lightweight fabrics. When you have anything sheer and soft like this and super lightweight, you'll need, again, to adjust your needle accordingly to help out. But often, like fine fabrics will very often get munched up a lot. So they'll want to just take the threads of the fabric through down to the machine sometimes. Can be, very tricky to have to navigate. When it's sheer, it's see-through. So you're going to have to make all of your seams and all your stitches really, really neat and tidy because it's see-through. You can see everything. So when you get to either end of those spectrums of heavy and super lightweight, it does become more difficult as well. So that is something to consider. Always those fabrics that kind of sit in the middle, quilting weight, a little bit above, a little bit below, are really sort of the easy choices in weights to work with. They just work. And then one more thing when you're looking at woven fabrics to sew with is the fray factor. So sometimes you'll have a very loose weave fabric. So that means all of these little yarns that make up the fabric, these are really loose. So they're sort of spread out as opposed to being lots of them jammed packed. So think 1,000 thread count bed sheets. That means that there's 1,000 threads all crammed in there and it's really tightly woven. They will not fray very much at all. But a lot of fabrics we get are quite loose woven. It actually makes a very nice garment to wear with a loose weave. But the thing is that a loose weave will fray like crazy. And sometimes if you're not aware of it and not looking at it, as soon as you cut it, it will just start fraying. And particularly when you're beginning, you're working and you're handling the fabric a lot because you're learning, and so you handle it even more than you would. And the more you handle fabrics like this, the more they fray, and it becomes an even bigger nightmare to have to deal with. So always just keep that in mind too, is if it is a super loose weave and if it's going to fray like crazy, if you know you have to handle it a lot, that might be something that you consider when you're choosing your fabrics for easy or hard. Now let's have a look at knit fabrics. How hard are they or easy to sew with? How do we choose? Again, drape is one of those things that do fall into the category because the drapier it is, the more it just wants to move around on you. Before we start, all knits, of course, as you should know, I think already, require a ballpoint or a stretch needle. So they require different stitches entirely. You can't just use a regular straight stitch on your machine, and you need a ballpoint needle. So it's rounded at the edge so it doesn't actually pierce and snap the fibers of a knit fabric. It needs to push them out to the side and go through. So that is a whole nother story. I have like videos on needles and everything, if you're interested in that, of course, as well. That is for another day. So aside from the drape, because the drapier it is, the more it wants to move, as we've talked about, I think in all of them, knits are really determined by the stretch, is how hard something is to sew. So the stretchier it is, the harder it will be to sew, because as you're putting this through your machine, you can see this is just going to stretch out like crazy, right? And your foot will push and it will want to stretch that. And when it gets stretched out, that's when you get that like wavy lettuce leaf look seams, and it's a disaster, right? So the least stretchy, this is what you call more stable knits. And again, this is a whole other topic on how to knit stretch and everything. But the less stretchy it is, the more stable it is, the easier it is to sew, because the less it will stretch under your foot in the machine, and it's just easier to work with. So that is definitely how you sort of determine easy and difficult knits, is mostly by the stretch. And then again, there is that curl factor when it comes to jersey. So whenever you cut jersey, for example, is a big culprit. When you stretch it, it instantly curls over, and it can be an absolute nightmare to have to deal with, of course, if you're not prepared, because you've got like your seam allowance just disappeared, and it's hard to try and roll it out every time you're working on it to sew it. So that is a factor. I definitely would avoid that if you're not looking for something too difficult to start with on a knit. Those stable knits that don't curl are definitely a good choice for a beginner on your knit projects. So as I said though, it's not about avoiding all of these more difficult fabrics to work with. It's about being prepared and knowing that you're going in with a little bit more difficult fabric, because when you go in prepared, The trouble comes is, as I said at the beginning, is when we go in and we just don't know that these are more difficult fabrics. We don't know that we need different needles for stretch fabrics. We don't know that like any of this. And so it turns into an absolute disaster, and we don't understand why, and it is basically just an utter disaster, and we get very disappointed. That's because we're not prepared. When you are prepared for these more difficult fabrics, that is when you'll see more success, and you'll feel still good about your achievements, because you know it was going to be a difficult fabric, but you did it anyway, and you learnt your lessons along the way, and that is what it's all about. I do hope you experiment more, and I do hope that that gives you a bit more light into choosing what to look for when you're both working, like cutting and sewing with different fabrics, and making easier and better choices depending on what you want for that project. So let me know your tips down below on what fabrics you like to work with or not, what you found easy or difficult, your tips for us as well. We'd love to hear them, because sharing our sewing knowledge is how we all get better at our sewing. So do check the description box below because I have left a bunch of other videos there. And if you're really interested in all of these fabrics and like getting into this world of knowing more about your sewing, I invite you to come join me at Vintage Sewing School because that is exactly what we do there. And I would love to have you in class. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.